Greetings to you today. Well, as you know, in this season we are on a quest to tell the whole story of the Bible from start to finish. And that's a multi-layered endeavor because it is not only about understanding the narrative of the book itself, but it's equally about seeing ourselves within this framework, grasping how the ancient story of this people and their God is simultaneously the story of each of our lives. And honestly, this endeavor can get a bit murky feeling, especially when we're transitioning now out of the great activity of the Exodus from Egypt and into the long chapters and books that are focused on the law. So instead, today, of just taking a descriptive approach, instead of me describing what the different rules and guidelines and ordinances are, I'd like to take a different tact. I would like for us to come alongside this holy text from a different angle. I want us to be oriented to the concepts of law and ritual in kind of a more meta way. And here's the main idea. You and I, and all humans everywhere, are deeply symbolic creatures. We live our lives immersed in a mental universe of sorts, a cosmos. And this internal and external pattern of meaning and imagination and ritual constructs the reality that we experience in this world. So whether you are consciously aware of it or not, you are built in such a way that requires you to piece together a story about your life and your God and your world and what it's all about. And the story that we piece together somewhere deep in the recesses of this neural network is always built of symbols and interpretation of symbols. It's built of rituals and patterns. It's built of beliefs that then inspire certain actions, and then those actions inspire those beliefs, and those beliefs inspire those actions. All of our storytelling is a self-reinforcing system that leads to either one kind of life or another. And I think it's no accident that in the story that we call Scripture, we find Yahweh explicitly observing that humans are built this way, and then subsequently delivering to the people a totally immersive system of symbols and practices that will altogether become, in a word, one culture. The most powerful force in all of the human world, a culture. A totalizing context for how we interpret life and thus direct our feelings and our actions. Okay, I know this is some heady stuff, but stay with me here for just a minute, if you will. Many of you know different parts of my own life story, and maybe you've heard me tell that from a young age, I had put certain pieces together in my own mind and become convinced that I was fundamentally a scientist. How those thoughts first entered my mind, God only knows. But God also knows that once a thought has entered a human mind, whether it's true or not, it tends to take on a life of its own. It begins to seek its own confirmation. A singular thought or an experience that we have early in life can easily become a self-fulfilling prophecy for us. Because once we tell ourselves something about the way the world works or about the way we are, all of our mental energies begin to align around that identity statement. Somehow, at a young age, it was suggested that I was good at science. And so, as way leads on to way, for the next 20 years, I consistently took the self-reinforcing steps that were gradually making me become a person of science. And let's be clear, that's not just a career path, it's an identity. Identity breeds passion. And once I had told myself a certain story about who I was, that mental symbol naturally became expressed in external forms and life choices, just as it does for all of us. In high school, I signed up for all of the advanced courses in chemistry and biology and physics. By the time I stepped for the first time into a college class, it was not even a question mark in my mind. I would obviously be concentrating my efforts in the arenas of molecular biology and protein chemistry. I knew it would take 5 years to do the double degrees, but it was never even in doubt, because it was the story that I had told myself about who I am in this world. And that kind of story in our heads is rarely questioned by us. I remember working at summer camp in that first year, just after my freshman year of college. Our leadership team at the camp came back a week early to train and prepare ourselves for the staff and the campers to arrive. I was called staff counselor, so that means that I was assigned to lead and guide the other college staff as they ministered to the kids. I remember that in that training week, one of our first assignments was to go out into the woods for 2 hours and simply observe and listen. Then, after 2 hours, we were going to come back together and share with each other what we had seen and what we had heard when we were alone with God. I remember my fellow leaders talking about things like the sense of peace that they felt in nature, or someone talked about a new realization they had come to about their prior year. All really good stuff. And then I vividly recall me describing my experience in the woods that day. I talked about how I spent those hours trying to arrive at an intuitive understanding of ecological succession in northwest woodlands. I remember talking about the majesty of observing these cedar trees that were taking their particular place in the climax forest that was unique to this peninsula. I spoke about my deepening awareness of God's subtle undergirding presence throughout the eons of natural processes, and about the necessary humility that all species must accept over time. Someone said, "Okay, wow." And then I believe the rest of the faces were just blank before we moved on. But you see, for many years before that, and for many still to come afterwards, I was in the process of quietly nurturing my own internal world, which consisted of attitudes and symbols and values and interpretations of everything around me. It was all funneled for me into becoming scientist. And so my eyes were naturally drawn to the interconnections and the sequences that I saw all around me. Even after my college years, when I made that somewhat impulsive choice to go to seminary in British Columbia instead of medical school, my personal quest and my internal sense of order dictated that my approach to theology would be about discovering the intersections of faith and natural sciences. See, by this point, I had been thoroughly formed in a worldview, and it was a worldview that valued things like realism and long natural evolutionary processes. These were the best ways, the best eyes with which to see and understand the universe around me. This remains true to me today, to be honest, because we never fully escape our early formation. But all of this is what made it even more shocking and repugnant to me when I at last arrived on the campus of what would be my fourth and final graduate school. My doctoral program was focused on what they called Christian futures in the 21st century. The campus was beautiful. It was set in a quiet forest in the most wealthy suburb of New York City. The school had a long and influential history in American Protestant thought, first in the Great Revivals, and then especially in womanist and other liberation theologies of the 20th century. It was different than any school or training that I'd done before, but I was really excited for the novelty of it. And then, on the first day of class, the director of our program introduced himself as a pre-modern Christian. Huh? He then went on to describe how his worldview was deeply informed by astrology and the signs of the zodiac. What? He explained that on his journey of faith, he had come to reject the supposed rationality of the modern sciences, and instead he found more inspiration in the ancient and medieval Jewish practices of numerology and the reading of star signs. And for the first time in my life, somebody I actually knew and liked was attempting to explain the history of world events to me in terms of the alignment of planets and constellations. My internal world of symbols and interpretations was offended by the absurdity of it all, and I felt upset. Or maybe Mercury was just in retrograde that day. I don't know. Eventually, I would come to love and value that program quite a bit, and all the people and all the ideas it held for me, even though I did have to go through a somewhat contentious approval process to allow them to have me use the word kingdom in my thesis because it was presumed to be sexist. That's for another conversation. For now, I just want to confess that it's a decade after I stepped into that classroom, and still, the most challenging and disruptive memory that I carry from those days was the realization that my professor called himself a pre-modern Christian astrologer. I've pondered this many times, and what I've come to understand in my own emotions is that the offense I took at a gut level was not so much about religious purity or truth. It was the violation I felt to the ordered system and symbols that I had spent so many years constructing and reinforcing for myself. And in the years since that experience, in my own understanding of the reaction that I felt, it has developed an opening, an understanding of another possibility for me, a possibility that now I can see is baked right into the heart of our scriptures. Now, I still remain pretty firmly convinced of certain things that I believe to be true in the world. For example, that the gravitational effects of a small rock 117 million miles away probably cannot alter my subconscious. But that's just another side note. Because the thing my professor opened up for me, in retrospect, was the possibility that for human beings and societies and cultures, the most important thing is not necessarily proving all of our ideas as true. The most important thing is how we immerse ourselves in an all-encompassing world of thoughts and beliefs and actions and rituals, because that is what most directly impacts how we live our lives. I had an assumed culture from birth. In my time and place, the values and the symbols of my reality were ordered around a vision of scientific inquiry. And so the embodied culture that I developed, the way I carried myself forward, was significantly impacted by that internal story that I had told. I've come to see that this is exactly what we find in the books of the law, those texts that were given to ancient Israel. What is handed on to this people is a completely immersive life experience, the creation of a culture. And this would become the single most determinative feature of who these people would be and what actions they would take in the real world. And I don't think this is just an accident of history or a series of silly human inventions. I think this was a God-given symbolic world passed along out of the recognition and a blessing of the fact that that world of meaning and interpretation that we occupy determines everything about how we actually live our lives. And for the God who is in the business of completely remaking this world over the span of millennia, one of the biggest priorities was to form a people group that had the longevity to operate on that time scale. Beginning with the Ten Commandments, which we read last week from Exodus 20. What follows now in the text is a series of no less than 613 individual laws that govern the life of the chosen people. This accounts for the remainder of the book of Exodus, and then also the books of Leviticus and Numbers. And then in Deuteronomy, you get the whole sequence and salvation plotline retold again in a somewhat different form. Now, I'm not sure if you've read these laws recently, but it's some strange stuff. There's the more palatable part of it, the rules that make sense to us. Things like how you're to pass on your inheritance, guidelines for how to conduct lawsuits, processes for dealing with murder or theft. And we genuinely find inspiration in rules about Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. There is much that intuitively makes sense to a modern person in this text. But let's be honest, these things are set right alongside some others without distinction. Things like ordinances for how to treat mildew, commandments about what kinds of food you're allowed to eat and how they must be prepared. It is repugnant to the Lord, for example, to eat a baby goat boiled in its own mother's milk. Now, there are detailed rituals that everybody has to participate in. There are carefully prescribed feasts and celebrations. The sacrifice of a red cow, we learned, is required if you accidentally touch a dead body. We're required to read certain texts in certain times. You're told how to present an offering of raw dough to the Lord. There's the prohibition against building a staircase in front of your altar because it would be shameful for Yahweh to see the nakedness under your skirt. Do not even think about weaving together a fabric that's made of both wool and linen. 613 laws like this. And then there's the elaborate construction of physical symbols to be placed right in their line of sight. Like the tabernacle, for instance, we read in Exodus 26, "Moreover, you shall make the tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine twisted linen, and blue, purple, and crimson yarn. You shall make them with cherubim skillfully worked into them. The length of each curtain shall be 28 cubits, and the width of each curtain 4 cubits. All the curtains should be the same size. 5 curtains shall be joined one to another, and the other 5 curtains joined one to another. You shall make loops of blue on the edge of the outermost curtain in the first set, and likewise loops on the edge of the outermost curtain in the second set. You shall make 50 loops on one curtain, and make 50 loops on the edge of the curtain that is in the second set. The loops shall be opposite one another, and you are to make 50 clasps of gold, and join the curtains one to another with the clasps, so that the tabernacle may be one whole." And so on. The book of Exodus goes into far more detail than what I've just read. But the result, when all is said and done, all of these symbols, all of these altars, all of these guidelines and ordinances, they become together an all-encompassing lifestyle. The altar, the tabernacle itself, is set right in the midst of the camp of the Israelites, and all of life is to revolve around this glittering structure in which God dwells mysteriously in the empty space that's above the ark. A God who cannot be seen or described, but who is nonetheless creating around that ineffable holy presence a structure of cloth and metal and ritual and priest and law and ordinances that are so vast and so complex that you could rightly say that the universe of symbols and practices would be all-consuming for this people. A universe of symbols and practices that would take all of their time and attention to maintain and embody. A universe of symbols and practices that would leave no room for other worldviews. And this would be guarded jealously by Yahweh. A universe of symbols and practices that probably would not hold up in their entirety to the modern culture of natural sciences, but a universe of symbols and practices that, although a young disciple in 2010 might have scoffed at as being a bit too astrological, has nonetheless come with it, for me, the realization that for the past 3,500 years, since those symbols and practices were handed down, to this day, the Jewish people scattered around the world have by and large remained one people, marked by the same customs, outliving empires and eras, with an unbroken experience of communal identity, always passing down from one generation to the next, the ancient memory of Yahweh's salvation and the promise for more to come. And when I realize that, I think with some embarrassment about the vast majority of people and families that I know today in the year 2020 who don't seem to have been capable of passing on an identity or a tradition to even one subsequent generation, let alone 87. And it leaves me wondering to myself, where does the deeper wisdom lie? Is it in my freedom of self-determination? My God-given right to mix and match symbols and practices and commitments according to my own preference? Is this how the world is to be remade? Now, the truth is, I'm not about to start reading star signs for myself, and I'm not prepared to construct my own tabernacle and follow the 613 ordinances. I'm not really tempted to abandon my learning about the natural world or pretend to be something that I am not. But what I've come to see in the quiet townships of New Jersey and in the books of the law is that my own ability to piece together whatever story suits me might just have some drawbacks. Maybe personally agreeing with or waiting to understand everything in detail might just be missing the point. Because, as Yahweh knew from the start, the most important and world-changing quirk of the human creature is the power of going all in on a story, inhabiting a cosmos of symbol and meaning that is so comprehensive that it can spill over and remake the world around us. You know, I'm a little suspicious that even my deep thoughts about photosynthesis and forest ecology might eventually be forgotten by my camp staff. But for 3,500 years now, and counting, The world has never been without the chosen people's witness to God's master plan. And that is the story that we still find ourselves in. Amen.